The federal deficit does not matter. Video number 4. This is a revised version. P.O.O.F.O.S.I.E. One of the main topics of discussion for this fourth video is one of the most important subjects, in my opinion, for the majority of we the American people, which is health care and how to pay for it. Former President Obama has the legacy of putting us on the right track as far as health care being made affordable, but he stopped short of explaining the ultimate payment method, and that may change in the near future with him coming forward and formally verbally making the same public statement former President George W. Bush and former Vice President Dick Cheney made, and I quote, "The deficit does not matter," end quote. This would mean that we can and eventually will pay for we the people single-payer/universal health care program, or our Medicare For All Healthcare program, if that's what it turns out to be called, by monetizing and or quantitative easing, which is government gobbledygook doublespeak for electronically generating monies to meet federal expenditures, as described in video number 3, and in this video we're going to dig a little deeper. By the way, my name is Oscar Dean Wyndham, and I have written the quintessential book on the subject of our irrelevant federal deficit, explaining in depth the how and whys, which of course explains that we don't really have a national debt, and it is the revised second edition titled All About Equity Spending with a Love Story. And now back to healthcare reform. Every time an elected federal representative from either party puts forth a new proposal that will require significant financial resources, the red flag of increased federal taxation is raised, and then the measure is severely scaled back or is rejected altogether. And once again, this is the strategy being deployed in order to defeat the latest health care measure, and hopefully it will fail this time because, as the accumulative information in the previous 3 videos has shown, we can electronically generate the monies needed, which means that there are no federal tax monies needed, and this means that the estimated price tag of $32 to $35 trillion, or whatever the actual figure turns out to be, over the next 10 years is not an obstacle in itself. The only obstacle to overcome is the mindset of the majority of we the people that would allow us to accept the reality of electronically generating monies to pay for our health care program, and this has proven to be a major obstacle. We the people are just having a tough time accepting this reality, in large part because of the fake news media refusing to even discuss this subject, and to me it seems obvious that this apparent conditioning of everyone, including the fake news media, is the result of millennia after millennia, century after century, generation after generation of not only tradition, but of deliberate brainwashing, dumbing down so as to have our species live in a perpetual delusional state of mind when it comes to anything that requires meaningful change, a departure from the status quo, and we must now overcome this delusion if we are to evolve, move forward as a people. The truth about our federal deficit being irrelevant has been staring us in the face for at least the last decade or so of our so-called modern age, which means that we have virtually unlimited financial resources to do just about anything we choose to do. However, those who are in the positions of leadership, and not all of them are as dumb as a post, will not come forward, as did former President George W. Bush, and lead by admitting that the deficit is irrelevant, which means that we can and should electronically generate monies to pay for our health care program. And while we're at it, let's put education from preschool to PhD, as well as the prison system, if not privatized, under the federal umbrella for payment and limited supervision, not total control. That would be in the hands of each state, which would hopefully develop into a sort of beneficial competitiveness, resulting in a cyclical improvement, thus perpetual enhancement of the healthcare system. This type of eventual administrative system should become perfunctory while encompassing all programs that are funded by electronically generated monies, which I refer to as equity spending, and which will be the type of payment for all federal expenditures. And before we can get to this advanced stage of enlightenment, we must first stop living in a perpetual delusional state of mind, and this break from the delusional state starts with the acceptance of the reality of our federal deficit being irrelevant. The acceptance of the how and why this is so, which is fully illustrated in my book, the revised second edition titled All About Equity Spending with a Love Story. To my knowledge, the only book in the entire world at this time that deals with this seemingly taboo, obscure subject of our federal deficit being irrelevant. As alluded to earlier, this taboo, obscure subject has a lot to do with ultimately altering the status quo. Oftentimes in the past, when an altering change must take place, we would hear the expression that when you make an omelet, you have to break a few eggs, and those eggs have always been the working class. This current omelet will require the eggs, which are primarily the gangster health insurance companies and some other elitist corporate entities, to be the eggs that are to be broken if we are to have a single-payer/universal healthcare system, or again, maybe Congress will choose to call this new healthcare system Medicare for All. In either case, we're talking about some multi-billion-dollar or in some cases trillion-dollar special interest groups being forced out of the healthcare business, or the public trough, some might say, and don't look for them to leave their institutionalized, legalized graft, or one could just say their slop, without a very strong resistance. On the other hand, there are the more righteous multi-billion-dollar companies like FedEx, Microsoft, and Tesla, just to name three, who will benefit enormously as a result of this widespread enlightenment, due to the fact that the average person will have a lot more disposable cash available to purchase the very useful consumer goods companies like these produce, which brings up the subject of the possibility of runaway inflation, which might be spurred on by runaway greed and or avarice. We'll just have to wait and see, but one possible, even probable, large part of the solution as far as prevention of runaway inflation goes is to make absolutely certain that every vendor that receives we the people's electronically generated federal monies is a not-for-profit company or is an oft-audited company working on a reasonable profit margin, like say 3 to 5%, depending on the sum in question, but the main stipulation would be that every electronically generated dollar, as much as is possible, is paid to a not-for-profit company, and every penny is accounted for. I can hear some of the elite squealing now, and as I said in my book, the revised second edition, titled All About Equity Spending with a Love Story, if you hear about me shooting myself in the back of the head 3 times, you shouldn't believe it. Just as an aside, some of the people who really want me dead is some of those in the gold-monger business, one of the biggest sting operations ever devised by man, next to the 2008 financial shakedown. No one will ever top that heist, but the gold-mongers are trying, and they have a lot of willing accomplices for a cut of the action. In this regard, just ask yourself who it is that has been the major advertisers for the current gold bamboozle. Moving on, we've talked about the reform of healthcare, but earlier it was mentioned that besides the electronic generation of monies to pay for healthcare, we should also bring the nation's prison system, if not privatized, under the federal umbrella for funding, and also the nation's public educational system from preschool to PhD. The nation's prison system is obviously in need of reform by all accounts, and there are dedicated individuals who have some of the answers, but until they have the monies to execute their ideas, they are just good ideas, and with equity spending, they will have all the monies they need, and there will probably be spectacular advancements made in the near future by these experts in the field of prisons and prison reform. For me, as an individual, it is hoped that they first and foremost acknowledge the long time now proven fact that when you have a privatized prison system, you have a great big mess of incompetence and corruption exemplified by the abuse of funding, with the first and seemingly most prevalent abuse being the incarceration of individuals, usually young black males, but mostly young males in general, who have committed battery on a law enforcement officer, or what is commonly called BOLO, in order to keep the numbers up in these prisons. It doesn't take much imagination to see how this law can be abused in order to keep the numbers up in the private prisons, especially since touching a law enforcement officer with an open hand can be a case of BOLO. This, coupled with youth, drugs, and alcohol, well, you fill in the blanks. All of these negative factors will have to be overcome in order to accomplish the intent of incarceration, which is to reform the individual and return of that person to society. But for me, the most positive aspect of it all is that there is the funding with what I call equity spending, which has always been the restricting factor up until now of having available funding. As for an example of the potential for this prison reform, one needs only go online and look at the Second Chances program. Moving on to the possibility for massive educational reform made possible by having this virtually unlimited funding, one can imagine how it would be possible to have every person in the United States have the opportunity to achieve their full potential. Just as a hypothetical outlook, let's imagine the paradigm. First, there would be having the best qualified personnel for teachers, which would, of course, mean that the salary would have to reflect the expectation of results. No more high school graduates who have grammar school reading, writing, and math skills. These highly competent teachers would all have full-time qualified teachers' aides in the classroom with them, and if need be, there could be as many as 2 or more, maybe even 4 or more if needed. Every classroom would be on live video feed with audio that is permanently recorded, giving anytime access to how their child is doing in school to every parent. Then there is the dropout problem that could be eliminated by paying a salary to students starting in the 10th grade and continuing on through their PhD with the appropriate conditions and stipulations. Like one that comes to mind for me is that when a student is paid this salary to go to school, this student must show up for class in the appropriate attire and the appropriate attitude for learning, or else see this lack of professionalism be reflected in their biweekly check, all intended for each as an individual being prepared to enter the workforce fully qualified. These qualifications could include reading, writing, and speaking at least 3 other languages besides English, and if I was in charge, every high school graduate would also be a qualified EMT or no graduation, and all of these abilities on top of the expected basics, plus the abilities you would like to see these young people have upon graduation. In order to achieve these goals, we are talking about year-round school, resulting in having high school graduates as young as 13 or 14 or maybe 16 with all these extra requirements. This is in all seriousness, and it might be added that the only reason that these types of achievements aren't already expected and in place, besides the funding issue, is because we the people don't demand it, because, in my opinion, every student has this potential ability if they have the proper instruction, which of course relates back to having qualified teachers, and again, they must be paid a salary indicative of their ability to teach, and they must be able to teach. We could go on and on with this discussion about the positive aspects of our nation's educational reform, not to mention prison reform and healthcare reform. However, the sticking point for all these issues is and always has been the funding. If we as a nation would only accept the reality of our federal deficit being irrelevant, the funding problems are eliminated, and yes, a whole lot of other problems pop up, like the threat of runaway inflation, which was covered in video number 1, which will all have to be addressed. But the point being made, and the contribution I'm giving to this whole discussion, is the data which indicates that the monies are available. All we as a nation have to do to receive these monies is to accept reality. Again, the federal deficit does not matter, and we don't really have a national debt. Before closing, allow me to once again refute the false accusation of this type of funding being a type of socialism or communism. Equity spending has absolutely nothing to do with either socialism or communism, mainly because neither actually exists nor has ever existed in the past, and the reason why socialism and communism does not now exist nor ever has really existed is the same reason neither will ever exist in the future. Both are lies, fantasies which are impossible to realize. Look up the definition for socialism, which is basically the same for communism. A political and economic theory of social organization which advocates that the means of production, distribution, and exchange be owned or regulated by the community as a whole. As a lifelong self-employed small businessman, I can tell you for sure from my personal experience that this type of system is impossible. And please allow me to reiterate what was stated in the description for video number 2, which is that this series of videos, now numbering 4, has everything to do with the fulfillment of the capitalism economic system as well as the reform thereof. The only economic system that has ever really performed and is being embraced globally by all nations, which of course includes the so-called communist nations of China and Russia and all other communist nations, so-called. As explained in my book, both China and Russia are emperor/dynasty type socio-economic systems that are being forced to accept the capitalist economic system because, again, it works. And also allow me to point out the fact that both these countries now have a benevolent dictatorship, which dictatorship is as a czar or emperor, and neither never ever will be anything but an emperor/dynasty-based government because they just can't grasp the concept as a nation for any other type of government, which compels me to state that we, the people of the United States, are a very, very unique as well as blessed people. Read my book for a more in-depth view, and it should be stated that for the most part, I'm preaching to the choir because so many people in the U.S. have college degrees these days. You can't find a job in many cases, but you're highly educated nonetheless, and this is a travesty. And no, I am not being snide. And with this higher education comes enlightenment of such things. So for a lot of you, I'm just telling you something you already know, which Senator Sanders is trying not to do. He and everyone else on the left is basically saying so far, from my point of view, hey, if the peasants want to believe in a fantasy, then why bother explaining? Because it is impossible for our nation, or any other nation for that matter, to ever be a socialist or communist regime/socioeconomic system anyways. At least that seems to be his position, and for the reasons a lot of you already know, and these same reasons are stated in my book. As we say in the South, Senator Sanders may get his butt caught in a crack and get it pinched if he keeps insulting the intelligence of we, the American people, like this. What he and President Trump and all of the other politicians should do is just tell we, the people, the truth about the federal deficit being irrelevant and then take it from there. Sure, the less enlightened in Congress will have to be dragged along like an anchor, but they will eventually catch on. There is a lot more to be discussed having to do with the false accusation and false belief in socialism and communism, and if you've read my book, it is pretty much covered. But for this video, allow me to once again state that equity spending has nothing to do with either, but instead is a completely different paradigm being presented, which has never been realized before, and it has taken mankind 6,000 years of recorded history to arrive at this pivotal point in history. The question now is, what choice will we make? More of the same old, or will we choose a bold new course never before embarked upon? I say let's boldly go where no man has gone before. I'll close with this question. Do we have the competent political leadership for this bold new course being largely predicated on accepting the reality of our federal deficit being irrelevant? In video 5, we will discuss how it is that President Trump is in the process of doing a belly flop into the pool from a high dive platform, being stone cold sober and not expecting it to hurt. Video number 4 transcript is available on my Facebook page, P.O.O.F.O.S.I.E.